It started, as many strange things do, with a forgotten box in a dusty corner. Not just any box, but one filled with the remnants of an obscure family's past, tucked away in the deepest part of a historical society's archives. Inside, wrapped in brittle, yellowed silk, was a daguerreotype from 1856. It was a mess, honestly, severely degraded, its silver surface tarnished to an almost opaque murk, like looking through dirty, ancient glass. You could barely make out shapes, let alone faces. It was almost indecipherable, a ghost of an image clinging to a metal plate. When the conservationists first saw it, they just shook their heads. Extreme fragility, they said. A challenge to restore, if it could even be restored at all. The initial assessment was pretty standard, probably a typical 19th century family portrait. Husbands, wives, kids, all stiffly posed, looking serious because smiling for photos wasn't really a thing back then. Nothing to get excited about, just another piece of the past waiting to be cleaned up and catalogued. The restoration began, a painstaking process. First, the delicate cleaning, removing layers of grime and oxidation that had built up over more than a century. Then the stabilization, making sure the fragile surface wouldn't crumble into dust. It was slow work, requiring tiny brushes and even tinier tools, all under powerful microscopes. Gradually, as the conservators worked, faint glimpses of figures started to emerge from the shadows, still indistinct, like smudges of ink on wet paper, but definitely human forms. You could see the outline of a dress, the suggestion of a man's coat, maybe a child's small head. But even in these early stages, before any real digital enhancement, subtle, unsettling details began to surface. A strange blur around one of the figures, not quite like motion blur, but something else. An unusual reflection in what might have been a window, or maybe just a trick of the light on the damaged surface. The team, being professionals, initially dismissed these as artifacts of degradation. "It's just the tarnish," someone would say. "The silver plate is uneven," another would offer. They had logical explanations for everything, as scientists do. Yet these little oddities kept popping up, and the lead historian, Dr. Aris Thorne, started to notice them more and more. Aris wasn't just a historian. He had a knack for finding stories where others saw only facts. He developed a growing fascination with this particular photo. He sensed something more than a simple family image, a feeling that went beyond the usual historical curiosity. It was a hunch, a gut feeling that there was something truly unique hidden beneath the grime. He decided to commit significant resources to its full restoration, pushing past the initial reluctance of his colleagues. "This one," he'd say, tapping the protective casing, "this one feels different." Then came the first unsettling revelation. After weeks of careful work, a minor, yet distinct, anomaly was confirmed. It wasn't just a blur anymore. A figure in the background, previously thought to be a wall decoration or a draped curtain, appeared to have an impossible posture. A limb that didn't quite fit the human form, bending in a way that just wasn't right. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. This sparked a quiet debate among the restoration team. Was it a trick of the eye, a double exposure, or something else entirely? The logical explanations started to sound a little less convincing. The emotional impact on the team was noticeable. The initial dismissals, the easy explanations, slowly turned into cautious curiosity. Then, as more details emerged, a creeping sense of unease settled in. The atmosphere in the lab, usually buzzing with quiet efficiency, shifted. People started speaking in hushed tones, glancing at the daguerreotype with a new kind of respect, or maybe a new kind of fear. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a photo anymore. It was something else. Despite the growing strangeness, Dr. Thorne pushed for continued meticulous work. He believed the photo held a significant, albeit dark, historical secret. His scientific curiosity was now intertwined with a sense of uncovering something truly monumental. He felt a responsibility to see it through, to understand what this image was trying to tell them from across the centuries. Even in its still partially unrestored state, the image seemed to exude a peculiar energy. It drew the team in, making them spend hours poring over its minute details, trying to decipher its secrets. Yet it also repelled them with its growing enigma, a feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong, about it. The silver plate, once just a faded relic, now seemed to hold a peculiar, almost living weight. The initial success in revealing details only deepened the mystery, suggesting that the true horrors lay just beneath the surface of the image, waiting for them to dig deeper. The team was on the edge of something they couldn't yet name, but knew was profoundly disturbing. With the early anomalies now undeniable, the team knew they needed to go further. They brought in even more advanced restoration techniques, pushing the limits of technology. Cutting-edge digital enhancement software was employed, able to peel back layers of degradation and time with astonishing precision. Spectral analysis, usually reserved for ancient manuscripts or forensic science, was used to penetrate deeper into the image's atomic structure, searching for hidden information. The goal was to leave no pixel, no silver halide crystal, unexamined. Slowly, painstakingly, the primary subjects of the photograph became clearer. It was indeed a family, a stern-faced couple, a man and a woman standing stiffly in the center. Their clothes were typical 19th century attire, the man in a dark suit, the woman in a modest dark dress with a high collar. Around them, several children, ranging in age from what looked like a toddler to a young teenager, stood or sat. Their expressions, now visible with startling clarity, were unusually somber. There was no hint of a smile, no playfulness in their eyes, just a heavy, almost vacant seriousness that felt out of place for a family portrait, even for that era. It was a seriousness that seemed to go beyond the typical long exposure times of daguerreotypes. As the figures sharpened, so did their surroundings. The background details emerged from the oppressive shadows. The setting of the photo was revealed to be a sparsely furnished, dimly lit room, possibly a parlor. There was a heavy, dark curtain in the background, a simple wooden table, and a few plain chairs. But the dominant feature was the shadows. They weren't just dark areas. They seemed to have a presence, almost consuming the edges of the frame, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. They were prominent, almost oppressive, giving the entire scene a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. Then came the moment that shattered all remaining scientific skepticism and plunged the team into a new kind of dread. A child in the photo, a young boy standing near his mother, had previously been dismissed as simply blurred due to movement or degradation. But as the spectral analysis finished its work, revealing the true, unadulterated image, the team saw it clearly, undeniably. The boy had an extra, elongated digit on one of his hands. It wasn't a thumb or a finger. It was something else, thinner, longer, almost tentacle-like, extending from his palm. And then there were his eyes. They didn't just reflect light, they seemed to absorb it, almost glowing with an unnatural internal luminescence that defied explanation. This was not a photographic error. This was not degradation. This was an undeniable impossibility staring back at them from 1856. The restoration team grappled with this impossible detail. The lab, usually a place of quiet concentration, erupted in a flurry of hushed whispers and frantic, disbelieving exclamations. Initial theories flew around the room, desperate attempts to rationalize what they were seeing. "It's an elaborate hoax," someone suggested, quickly dismissed by the age of the daguerreotype and the sheer effort such a hoax would have required. "Optical illusion, maybe an unusual reflection," offered another, but the clarity of the detail made it impossible to ignore. Dr. Thorne, though visibly shaken, insisted on scientific rigor. "We reanalyze, we cross-reference, we find every possible explanation," he commanded, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. He knew deep down that they wouldn't find a conventional explanation. While the technical team re-examined every byte of data, researchers were dispatched to delve into the historical context. They pored over records of the era, parish registers, census data, local newspapers, anything that might shed light on the potential family associated with the photo. They searched for accounts of genetic anomalies, unusual birth defects, or strange medical conditions from the mid-19th century that could explain the boy's hand. No immediate answers were found. The family, if they could even be identified, seemed to have vanished from the historical record, leaving no trace. It was as if they existed only within the confines of this single, disturbing image. The photo's psychological effect on the team became increasingly pronounced. Members reported feeling an increasing sense of dread or discomfort when working directly on the image. Some described a coldness that seemed to emanate from the silver plate, even when it was encased. Others experienced vivid, disturbing dreams, fragmented images of the stern-faced family, the shadowed room, and the boy's impossible hand. The dreams often left them waking in a cold sweat, with a lingering sense of unease that lasted throughout the day. It wasn't just a picture anymore. It was something that seemed to reach out and touch their minds. Dr. Thorne's growing obsession with the daguerreotype was palpable. The impossibility of what they had found, instead of deterring him, fueled his determination. He viewed it not as a problem to be solved, but as a challenge to his very understanding of history and reality. He spent long nights in the lab, staring at the enhanced images, convinced that the photo held a secret far grander and more terrifying than anyone could imagine. His colleagues worried about him, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he sometimes spoke to the image, as if it could hear him. In their desperate search for answers, the team expanded their research to include any historical accounts of anomalies, deformities, or strange phenomena from the mid-19th century, hoping to find parallels. They looked into medical journals of the time, local folklore, even early spiritualist movements, trying to find anything that could contextualize the impossible image. They found stories of changelings, of people born with strange marks, but nothing that explained the clear, distinct, impossible digit or the unnatural glow in the boy's eyes. Just as they thought they had seen the most shocking revelation, a new, chilling detail emerged. As more layers were revealed through the spectral analysis, pushing the digital enhancement to its absolute limits, a faint, almost transparent figure was detected in the periphery of the image. It was barely perceptible, a ripple in the shadows near the edge of the frame, but undeniably present. And it was not a human form. It was too tall, too slender, too indistinct, like smoke given a vague shape. It was a presence, lurking, waiting, and it confirmed their deepest unspoken fears. They had only just begun to scratch the surface of this impossible photograph. The team, now thoroughly shaken by the discovery of the transparent figure, shifted its primary focus to this new and unsettling anomaly. They employed even more refined techniques, pushing the limits of their spectral analysis and digital enhancement software. What had initially been a vague ripple in the shadows became their sole obsession. Every pixel, every light frequency was scrutinized with a new intensity, driven by a mixture of fear and insatiable curiosity. Through painstaking work, the vague shape began to coalesce into a discernible, non-humanoid form. It wasn't a trick of the light or a smudge on the daguerreotype. It was undeniably a figure, tall and gaunt, with an unnatural fluidity to its outline. Its features remained indistinct, like looking through frosted glass, but the overall impression was clear. This was something ancient and malevolent. It didn't belong in any known biological classification. It seemed to be woven from the very fabric of shadow, yet possessed a disturbing solidity. Analysis of the entity's position revealed an even more disturbing truth. The figure appeared to be standing just behind the family, partially obscured by the room's dim lighting, as if observing them from within the shadows. It wasn't merely in the background, it was with them, a silent, unseen participant in the family portrait. Its placement suggested a deliberate hidden presence, a secret lurking just beyond the family's conscious perception, yet captured by the sensitive silver plate. The family's unawareness of this lurking horror heightened the terror. The expressions of the stern-faced couple and their children in the photo remained stoic, almost vacant, seemingly oblivious to the presence of the entity. They stared straight ahead, unblinking, into the camera, their faces betraying no hint of the monstrous form standing just inches behind them. This lack of reaction made the entity even more terrifying. Was it truly invisible to them, or were they simply frozen in a moment of forced composure, unwilling or unable to acknowledge the impossible thing sharing their space? The impossible perspective of the entity challenged the very nature of the daguerreotype process itself. This was a technology that captured light reflecting off physical objects. How could such a faint, ethereal being, one that seemingly existed outside normal perception, have been captured by the primitive technology of 1856. It defied every understanding of photography, physics, and even reality. It suggested that either the entity possessed some unknown physical property that allowed it to register on the plate, or the daguerreotype itself was capable of capturing more than just visible light. Debate and genuine fear began to spread among the team. The initial scientific detachment had completely evaporated. The restoration team was now genuinely unnerved, their voices softer, their movements more hesitant. Some suggested abandoning the project entirely, advocating for the daguerreotype to be sealed away or even destroyed. They feared what else might be uncovered, what other impossible horrors lay hidden within the silver surface. The atmosphere in the lab was thick with anxiety, a palpable sense of dread that permeated every conversation. Others, however, were drawn deeper into the mystery, their scientific curiosity now tangled with a morbid fascination. They felt a strange pull, a need to understand what they had stumbled upon, even if it led them into uncharted and terrifying territory. Dr. Thorne's resolve, rather than weakening, only strengthened in the face of this growing fear. He saw this as an unprecedented historical discovery, a find that pushed the boundaries of what was known about the past, about reality itself. He believed they had a responsibility to understand it, no matter how unsettling. His determination was almost fanatical, fueling his long hours and his unwavering focus on the image. He knew they were dealing with something beyond their initial comprehension, something that shattered conventional wisdom, and he was determined to see it through. With the scientific explanations failing, the team expanded its historical research to include more esoteric fields. They delved into local legends, superstitions, and occult practices from the mid-19th century, specifically focusing on the region where the photo originated. They scoured old texts for mentions of malevolent spirits, shadow beings, or rituals that might explain the entity's presence. They looked at forgotten cults, secret societies, anything that touched upon the supernatural, hoping to find a parallel, a context for the impossible image they held. As their work continued, strange occurrences began to manifest in the lab, no longer easily dismissed as stress or coincidence. Faint whispers, barely audible, would drift through the air when no one was speaking. Cold spots would suddenly appear, sending shivers down their spines, only to vanish moments later. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably, screens flickering, data becoming corrupted, then returning to normal without explanation. These were initially attributed to stress or coincidence, but as they grew in frequency and intensity, a chilling pattern began to emerge. The entity, it seemed, was making its presence known beyond the confines of the photograph. Closer examination using extreme magnification and newly developed algorithms to enhance the most subtle details began to reveal unsettling features of the entity itself. Its form, while still indistinct, showed hints of eyes that seemed to glow faintly, like embers in the dark, or an unnatural aura around its form, a shimmer that wasn't quite light, wasn't quite shadow. It was as if the entity was actively looking out of the photograph, its gaze somehow directed at the viewer, at them. This realization sent a fresh wave of terror through the team. The image wasn't just a static capture of the past. It was a window, and something was looking back. The team's focus narrowed, zeroing in on those unsettling, glowing points that served as the entity's eyes. They pushed the limits of their magnification tools, manipulating light sources and digital filters in ways they hadn't before, determined to understand what they were truly seeing. The process was slow, painstaking, each pixel a battle against the grain of the old daguerreotype. Hours blurred into days as they meticulously worked, each technician feeling the weight of the task, the growing sense of dread that accompanied every new detail. Then, with a final adjustment to a complex algorithm, the truth of the eyes snapped into horrifying clarity. They were not eyes in any biological sense, not pupils or irises. Instead, they were deep black voids, holes that seemed to absorb all light, reflecting absolutely nothing. Yet despite their emptiness, they possessed an undeniable intensity, a palpable presence that made everyone who saw them feel profoundly uncomfortable. It was as if these dark apertures were not just looking, but seeing into something beyond the image. There was a chilling intelligence behind their nothingness, a malevolent awareness that sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened researchers. A chilling realization soon followed, one that tightened the knot of fear in everyone's stomach. The entity's eyes, those twin abysses of darkness, seemed to be subtly directed, not generally at the camera, but specifically at one of the children in the photograph, a young girl standing near the center of the family group. Or perhaps it was looking directly at the viewer, at them. The ambiguity was almost worse than certainty, allowing their minds to fill in the terrifying blanks. This gaze, whether at the innocent child or at the observer, created a profound sense of being watched, a feeling that went beyond mere photographic composition. The photo now felt overtly menacing, no longer a static relic, but an active, perceiving entity. It was no longer just an object, it was a presence. The strange phenomena in the lab, previously dismissed as minor quirks, now escalated dramatically. They were no longer faint whispers or cold spots. Objects began to move on their own, small items sliding across desks, doors creaking open and shut when no one was near. Shadows, once mere illusions of light, seemed to detach themselves from their sources, dancing in the corners of their vision, twisting into grotesque shapes before vanishing. A pervasive sense of dread settled over the workspace, a constant heavy blanket that made breathing feel difficult, every shadow a potential threat. The air grew heavy, like before a storm, but the only storm was the one brewing within the daguerreotype. The team's growing terror was undeniable. Some members, unable to cope with the escalating disturbances and the sheer impossibility of what they were uncovering, refused to work on the photo directly. They opted for remote analysis from other rooms, or even from their homes, creating a physical distance from the source of their fear. Others who remained in the lab became visibly shaken. They reported nightmares filled with the entity's void-like eyes, vivid hallucinations of shadows lurking just out of sight, and extreme anxiety that made it impossible to concentrate. The project, once a source of intellectual fascination, had become a psychological torment. Dr. Thorne, usually a beacon of calm and scientific rigor, found himself increasingly isolated in his relentless pursuit. His scientific curiosity, once pure, was now inextricably intertwined with a palpable fear. He felt a heavy sense of responsibility for what they had unleashed, for the doors they had unknowingly opened. Sleep became a luxury he rarely afforded himself, his mind constantly replaying the impossible details of the image, searching for an answer, a logical explanation that simply wasn't there. He felt the weight of the entity's gaze, even when not looking at the photo, a constant pressure at the back of his mind. Attempts to cross-reference the photo with other historical images or data yielded increasingly bizarre results. Digital files containing historical records related to the mid-19th century would inexplicably corrupt or disappear when accessed near the daguerreotype. Computers would freeze, networks would crash, and data backups would fail. It was as if the photo itself itself was actively resisting any attempt to place it within a conventional historical context, or perhaps it was affecting the very systems designed to analyze it. This suggested that the photo might be influencing not just the human psyche, but also the digital realm, a chilling thought that added another layer to the mystery. The scientific explanations they had clung to began to crumble completely. Theories of optical illusions, elaborate hoaxes, or even collective hysteria no longer held any sway. The evidence of the entity's presence, its malevolent gaze, and the escalating disturbances were too undeniable. Slowly, hesitantly at first, then with increasing conviction, theories of a malevolent spirit or an active entity captured within the daguerreotype began to gain traction among the team. It was a terrifying leap of faith, an admission that they were dealing with something utterly outside the bounds of known science, something supernatural. Then came the final, most unsettling detail. Through advanced spectral analysis, they detected a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the entity's posture or position. It wasn't a change captured in a single frame, but rather a slight alteration that appeared in different layers of the daguerreotype, as if the entity had moved infinitesimally between the moments the light touched the silver plate. This implied a dynamic rather than static presence. The entity wasn't just in the photo, it was active within it. It was a living, breathing, moving thing trapped within the confines of the silver plate, and it was watching them. The team's mounting fear turned into a chilling realization. The daguerreotype wasn't just an inert image, it was actively influencing its surroundings. Devices brought near it began to behave erratically. Magnetic fields, usually stable in the lab, would fluctuate wildly, causing compasses to spin uselessly. The temperature in the immediate vicinity of the photo would drop several degrees, creating cold spots that no HVAC system could explain. Electronic equipment, from the high-powered computers used for restoration to simple handheld devices, would malfunction. Screens would flicker, programs would crash, and data would corrupt, not just when accessed, but when merely in proximity to the silver plate. It was as if the photo was draining energy, or perhaps emitting some kind of disruptive force that warped the very fabric of their controlled environment. Personal accounts from the team members became increasingly disturbing. No longer were they just reporting nightmares or a general sense of unease. They spoke of waking up to shadows that seemed to move on their own, just at the edge of their vision. Some swore they heard faint whispers, indistinct but undeniably present, when they were alone in their homes. Others described feeling a cold, fleeting touch on their skin, like an icy finger tracing their arm, only to find nothing there. These were no longer dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations or overactive imaginations. The shared nature of these experiences and their increasing intensity pointed to something far more sinister, something that had latched onto them from the moment they began to uncover the photo's secrets. Driven by the entity's confirmed presence, Dr. Thorne pushed for renewed historical research, focusing not just on the family in the photo, but on any anomalies connected to them. What they uncovered was a dark, suppressed secret that had been carefully buried by generations. The family, the Eldridges, had a history riddled with unexplained disappearances among their distant relatives, whispers of mental illness that seemed to manifest as profound paranoia and delusions, and disturbing rumors of occult involvement stretching back decades before the daguerreotype was made. There were fragmented records of strange gatherings in the secluded Eldridge estate, hushed accounts of missing livestock, and even a local legend about a shadowy figure seen near their property, a figure that only appeared at night. A horrifying hypothesis began to emerge, one that made their blood run cold. The family in the photograph wasn't merely photographed with the entity as innocent bystanders caught in its presence. They were somehow deeply involved with it. The stoic expressions, the unnatural stillness, the way they seemed to almost blend into the oppressive shadows of the room. It all pointed to a connection, perhaps a pact, either willingly entered into or forced upon them. Were they victims, or were they participants? The line blurred, and the implications were terrifying. The relentless stress, the growing fear, and the sheer intellectual challenge of confronting an impossibility began to take a severe toll on Dr. Thorne. He became increasingly obsessive, forgetting to eat, barely sleeping, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. His usual meticulousness gave way to a frantic energy, a desperate need to understand, to control, to find an answer. He grew increasingly paranoid, convinced that the entity was not just in the photo, but was watching him, influencing his thoughts, subtly guiding his research towards its own ends. His colleagues watched him with concern, seeing the once brilliant historian slowly unraveling under the pressure. He was losing himself in the mystery, becoming as much a part of the enigma as the photo itself. Attempts to contain the photo's influence were met with limited success. They tried physically isolating the daguerreotype in lead-lined boxes, then in Faraday cages, then within a specially constructed soundproof chamber designed to block all external interference. While these measures seemed to slightly dampen the more overt disturbances in the lab, the photo's influence persisted, albeit subtly. The cold spots still appeared, albeit less frequently. The electronic malfunctions continued, though less catastrophically. It was like trying to contain a gas leak with a sieve. The entity's presence was simply too pervasive, too fundamental to be easily blocked. Then came the most chilling discovery yet. During one of the advanced audio analyses of the enhanced photo, focusing on the background noise that had previously been dismissed as static, faint, almost subliminal patterns were detected. Rhythmic ticks, like a slow, deliberate heartbeat, then whispers, distorted and ancient, yet undeniably present. It wasn't just random noise, it was structured, repetitive, and seemed to emanate directly from the entity's location within the image. It was a form of communication, a low, guttural hum that spoke of patience, power, and an ancient malevolence. The entity was not silent, it was speaking, and they were finally beginning to hear it. This led to a terrifying realization. The daguerreotype might not just be an image of a malevolent entity, a passive record of an impossible moment. It was a conduit for it, a window into another, darker reality, a thin veil separating their world from something ancient and hungry. The silver plate was not a prison, but a gateway, and they, in their scientific arrogance, had been prying it open. The historical significance of the artifact shifted dramatically. It was no longer merely a relic to be studied, a piece of the past to be understood. It was a dangerous, active phenomenon, a living threat that demanded a completely new approach, far beyond conventional restoration or historical analysis. Their job had changed from preservation to containment, from understanding to survival. The team faced a profound moral dilemma, a choice that weighed heavily on their souls. Should they destroy the dangerous artifact, shatter the silver plate, and hope to protect themselves and the world from whatever unspeakable horror they had uncovered? Or should they continue to study it, risking unknown, potentially catastrophic consequences, all for the sake of knowledge, for the slim chance of understanding what lay beyond the veil? The debate raged, fueled by fear, intellectual curiosity, and a growing sense of dread. The fate of the daguerreotype, and perhaps their own, hung in the balance. The debate about destroying the daguerreotype or continuing their research was fierce, but Dr. Thorne, despite his frayed nerves, held firm. He argued that destroying it without understanding it would be a greater risk. What if its influence spread even without the physical object? What if understanding its nature was the only way to truly neutralize it? His argument, though tinged with desperation, swayed enough of the team members. They would continue, but with a new focus, understanding the ritual. Dr. Thorne pushed the team into an intense, almost feverish deep dive into occult history. Their research broadened beyond mainstream historical archives. They scoured forgotten texts, translated obscure manuscripts, and delved into the shadowy corners of libraries, looking for any mention of strange practices, forgotten sects, or dark pacts from the 19th century, especially those involving photography or mirrors. It was a race against time, a desperate scramble for knowledge before whatever was trapped in the photo broke free. Then, a breakthrough. One of the junior researchers, a quiet woman named Eleanor who had a knack for languages, found fragmented texts in an old leather-bound book from a private collection. The texts, written in a strange mix of Latin and an archaic European dialect, described an obscure, dangerous ritual. It involved the binding of an ancient entity, a shadow weaver, through a photographic process, using human fear and despair as anchors. The ritual required specific postures, certain expressions, and a dark, confined space, details that sent a chill down everyone's spine. The connection between the ritual and the photo was undeniable, almost sickening. The strange postures of the family, previously dismissed as photographic peculiarities, now made horrifying sense. Their somber, almost terrified expressions were not just typical for the era. They were part of the ritual, perhaps expressions of the fear meant to fuel the binding. The dimly lit, sparsely furnished room in the background, with its oppressive shadows, was precisely the kind of space described in the texts for such a dark pact. And the entity's presence, the transparent figure lurking in the periphery, was the shadow weaver itself, bound to the image. The horrifying implication was clear. The family in the photo was not merely victims caught in an unfortunate circumstance. They were participants. Whether coerced or willingly, they had engaged in this dark pact. The texts hinted at desperate promises, forbidden knowledge, or dark power offered in exchange for a terrible price. Perhaps they sought wealth, or a cure for an illness, or revenge, not realizing the true cost. The entity's true nature, as described in these ancient texts, was even more terrifying. It was called a soul collector, feeding on fear and despair, capable of subtly altering reality around it. It didn't just exist, it consumed. It grew stronger with every moment of terror it inspired, every flicker of doubt or paranoia it caused. The disturbances in the lab, the nightmares, the growing dread, all were part of its feeding, its slow, insidious growth. Now the daguerreotype was understood in a new, terrifying light. It wasn't just an image, it was a prison trapping the entity within its silver plate, a cage of light and chemicals. Or perhaps it was a key, allowing the entity to exert its influence beyond the image, slowly chipping away at the barriers between worlds. The distinction was crucial, but also terrifyingly blurred. As the team deciphered more about the ritual, the disturbances in the lab became more aggressive, more targeted. Equipment malfunctions became more frequent and violent. Whispers seemed to call out individual names. Objects flew across the room, not just falling. It was as if the entity, now understanding that its binding was being exposed, was lashing out, aware of their progress, aware of their attempts to understand its imprisonment. Dr. Thorne, despite his deteriorating mental state, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was the one who had pushed for this research, the one who had insisted on understanding. Now, he felt a moral imperative to see it through, to understand and potentially neutralize the threat they had inadvertently awakened. It was a personal quest now, a desperate gamble for knowledge, even at great personal cost. He knew he might not survive, but he couldn't stop. Then came the most crucial detail, a sliver of hope mixed with profound dread. The ritual, the texts suggested, might have been incomplete or flawed. This explained why the entity was subtly trapped, but still exerting influence, why it hadn't fully broken free. There was a loophole, a missing step, or a failed element in the original binding. This imperfection was what kept it from fully manifesting, but it also meant that its containment was fragile, its prison weak, and if they could understand the flaw, perhaps they could either complete the binding or, more dangerously, undo it. The stakes had never been higher. Their lives, and perhaps more, depended on deciphering this ancient, terrible ritual. They were no longer just historians. They were accidental exorcists, standing on the precipice of an ancient horror. The daguerreotype, once a fragile relic, now pulsed with a dark, unsettling energy. Its silver surface, usually still and reflective, began to show physical signs of stress, far beyond its initial degradation. Fine cracks like spiderwebs spread from the edges, not from mishandling, but as if something from within was pushing outward. The image itself seemed to shift, the faces of the family occasionally blurring, then sharpening, their expressions twisting into momentary grimaces that weren't there a second before. It was as if the entity trapped inside was struggling, thrashing against its invisible bonds, desperate to break free. The disturbances in the lab, which had been subtle and unsettling, now escalated into undeniable physical manifestations. The cold spots intensified, becoming localized zones of freezing air that made breath visible. The whispers, once faint and indistinct, now formed coherent words, though in no language any of them recognized. They were guttural, hissing sounds that seemed to claw at the edges of their sanity. Shadows, no longer content to merely play tricks on their eyes, detached themselves from walls and equipment, writhing and stretching independently, sometimes coalescing into vague, menacing shapes that vanished the moment they were directly looked at. The entity wasn't just influencing the environment anymore, it was actively attacking their minds. Team members reported terrifying hallucinations, loved ones with distorted faces, insects crawling under their skin, familiar sounds turning into screams. Paranoia became rampant. Arguments broke out over minor things, fueled by sleepless nights and the constant pressure of the malevolent presence. Dr. Thorne watched, horrified, as his dedicated team began to fracture, their trust eroding under the relentless psychological assault. Each person's deepest fears were being exploited, twisted, and thrown back at them by an unseen tormentor. Driven by a desperate need for answers and perhaps a touch of madness, Dr. Thorne decided he had to confront it directly. He stood before the daguerreotype, now encased in multiple layers of protective glass, but still radiating its oppressive aura. He spoke to it, his voice hoarse, demanding answers, trying to understand its nature, its purpose, its weakness. He didn't expect a reply, not a direct one. But as he spoke, a chilling, ancient voice responded. It didn't come from the air, but seemed to emanate directly from the photo itself, a vibration that resonated in his bones rather than his ears. It spoke in a language no human had ever heard, a series of guttural clicks and hisses, interspersed with sounds like tearing cloth and grinding stone. Yet somehow, the malice and hunger it conveyed were unmistakable, universal. As the voice faded, the image on the daguerreotype flickered violently. The cracks on the surface pulsed with a faint, unholy light. Then, for a horrifying moment, the image distorted completely, stretching and warping as if it were made of liquid. It no longer showed the family or the shadowed entity. Instead, it seemed to open, like a window into another place. Dr. Thorne caught a glimpse, a swirling vortex of impossible colors, geometric shapes that defied logic, and fleeting shadows of monstrous forms moving within. It was a dark, impossible realm, and the photo was no longer just an image but a portal, struggling to fully open. The remaining team members, those who hadn't fled or succumbed to the psychological horror, worked frantically. They tried to implement counter-rituals, drawing on the fragmented texts they had found. They painted symbols on the walls, burned strange herbs, and chanted protective phrases, their voices trembling with fear. But their knowledge was limited, incomplete. They were archaeologists, historians, not occultists. Their efforts felt like trying to plug a dam with their bare hands. The entity, sensing its opportunity, made a concerted effort to fully manifest in the physical world. The lab began to shake violently, as if hit by an earthquake. Fluorescent lights shattered, sending sparks flying. Power surges caused equipment to explode, filling the air with the smell of ozone and burning plastic. A profound sense of wrongness, a crushing despair, filled the room, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The air grew heavy, like water. Shadows solidified, pressing in on them, threatening to consume them whole. Amidst the chaos, Dr. Thorne remembered a sliver of text, a forgotten detail from the ritual, a line he had dismissed as poetic flourish. It spoke of the key of sorrow, offered willingly. It was a difficult choice, a terrible sacrifice. He looked at the daguerreotype, still flickering, still trying to open. He understood now. The family hadn't just made a pact, they had offered something precious, a part of themselves, to bind the entity. To contain it, they needed a similar offering, a sacrifice. It wasn't about destroying the photo, it was about reaffirming the binding, but at an immense personal cost. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but he knew it would be painful, perhaps even final. This was their last, desperate hope. Dr. Thorne gripped the daguerreotype, its surface now pulsing with an inner light that seemed to mirror the chaos erupting around them. The lab was a maelstrom of destruction, but his focus narrowed to the faint, metallic plate in his hands. The entity, now a semi-corporeal mass of shifting shadows and eyes of pure void, writhed in the center of the room, its form almost solid, its hunger palpable. It was a terrifying, impossible presence, a nightmare made real, and it was reaching for them. "The key of sorrow," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the entity and the collapsing lab. He looked at the remaining team members, their faces streaked with dust and terror, huddled in a corner, trying to enact their desperate, half-understood counter-rituals. They were out of time. The entity was almost fully through. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, picturing the ancient texts, the fragmented clues. "Offered willingly," he repeated, a cold dread settling in his stomach. The family in the photo had sacrificed something, a piece of their very essence, to bind this thing. To re-imprison it, he needed to do the same. It wasn't about physical pain, not exactly. It was about a deeper, more profound surrender. With sudden resolve, Dr. Thorne stepped forward, away from the cowering team, directly into the path of the encroaching darkness. He held the daguerreotype out, not as a weapon, but as an offering. The entity paused, its form flickering, its attention drawn to the gleaming plate. It seemed to recognize its prison, its gateway. "I understand," Dr. Thorne said, his voice now clear, cutting through the din. "You feed on sorrow, on despair. But true sorrow is not given easily. It must be earned." He wasn't speaking to the entity with words, but with intent, with a raw, emotional honesty that transcended language. He thought of his life's work, the years of dedication, the pursuit of knowledge, the very thing that had led him to this horrifying moment. He thought of the sacrifices he had already made for his research, the personal relationships neglected, the quiet, lonely hours. He thought of the fear, the isolation, the creeping madness that had been his constant companion since this photo had entered his life. Then he made the ultimate offering. He willingly surrendered the one thing he held most dear, the very core of his being that defined him, his relentless, insatiable curiosity. He let go of the need to know, the drive to uncover every secret, to understand every impossibility. He released his scientific ambition, his intellectual pride, his burning desire for answers, allowing it to flow out of him, a tangible sorrow, a profound loss of self. It was a wrenching, agonizing act, a self-mutilation of the soul. As this profound, willing sacrifice poured from him, it met the entity. The swirling shadows recoiled, not from pain, but from something alien to it, something it couldn't consume, couldn't corrupt. The sorrow he offered wasn't born of fear or despair, but of a conscious, deliberate choice to relinquish his deepest purpose. It was was a sorrow of self-annihilation, pure and unblemished by terror. The entity shrieked, a sound that tore at the fabric of reality and began to shrink, to condense. The impossible colors in the daguerreotype flickered once more, then intensified, pulling the receding shadows back into its depths. The lab stopped shaking. The light fixtures ceased their sparking. The crushing despair in the air lifted, replaced by an unsettling stillness. With a final, desperate gasp, the entity was sucked back into the daguerreotype. The cracks on the silver plate sealed themselves, leaving only faint, ghost-like lines. The light faded. The image, though still unsettling, returned to its original static state, a stern-faced family, a shadowed figure, eyes that reflected nothing. The lab was in ruins. Debris lay everywhere. A heavy silence hung in the air, broken only by the ragged breathing of the surviving team members. Dr. Thorne stood amidst the wreckage, the daguerreotype clutched in his hand. He felt empty, hollowed out. The burning drive that had fueled his entire life was gone, replaced by a vast, echoing void. He had won, but at a cost far greater than he could have imagined. The team, traumatized and shaken, eventually recovered, physically at least. The official explanation was a massive electrical fire, a catastrophic equipment malfunction. All research on the daguerreotype was declared a loss. The project officially terminated. Dr. Thorne oversaw the cover-up, his face expressionless, his eyes distant. He ensured that every shred of evidence, every file, every note that hinted at the impossible truth was destroyed. The daguerreotype itself was sealed away, not in any museum or archive, but in a lead-lined vault deep beneath the facility, its existence erased from all official records. It was too dangerous to destroy, too terrifying to forget. It remained a silent, silver-plated testament to a horror barely contained, a reminder of the price of forbidden knowledge. Dr. Thorne himself was profoundly changed. He continued his work, but the light in his eyes was gone. The passionate spark of curiosity had been extinguished, replaced by a quiet, almost melancholic efficiency. He became a shell of his former self, a historian who no longer sought to uncover the past, but merely to manage it, to ensure its more dangerous secrets remained buried. He lived with the lingering question, a constant, chilling whisper in the back of his mind. Was the entity truly contained, or merely dormant, waiting for another willing offering? And what other impossible horrors might history hold, waiting to be rediscovered, ready to exact their own terrible price? The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of dread, of an uneasy truce with the unknown.